Ghastly Garlic Episode 50. Haunted Skies, The Ghosts of Flight 318. Prologue. On a cold December night in 1972, Flight 318, a state-of-the-art airliner, soared through the dark skies over Florida, destined for a routine landing. The crew, experienced and confident, had no reason to suspect anything unusual. Yet, deep within the aircraft's belly, an unnoticed mechanical error began a sequence of events that would change aviation history forever. As the plane approached its final descent, a malfunction in the landing gear light caused the crew to become distracted. Unbeknownst to them, the autopilot was accidentally disengaged, and the plane began a gradual, unnoticed descent toward the swamps of the Everglades. The passengers remained blissfully unaware as the plane silently plummeted into the dense, murky waters below. The crash was catastrophic. Of the 176 souls on board, 101 perished in the cold, unforgiving swamp. Those who survived were left to face the unimaginable horror of being trapped in the dark, alligator-infested waters, surrounded by the wreckage of the once majestic aircraft. But the story of Flight 318 did not end with the crash. In the months that followed, strange reports began to surface. Crew members on other flights claimed to see the apparitions of those who had died in the crash. These ghosts, seemingly bound to the aircraft, were said to appear with warnings, messages of doom, and sometimes, eerie silence. It soon became apparent that these sightings were not mere hallucinations. The apparitions always appeared on planes that had been fitted with salvaged parts from Flight 318. The ghostly figures, forever trapped between the realms of the living and the dead, seemed to be seeking something, perhaps justice, perhaps peace, or perhaps simply a way to warn others of the dangers that lurked in the skies. This is the story of one such encounter, where the boundaries between life and death blur, and where the past refuses to stay buried. Chapter 1, The Whisper of the Past. Jack Dawson, a seasoned flight engineer, had heard the stories, whispers of ghostly apparitions haunting the planes, of crew members seeing the faces of the dead in unexpected places, of voices speaking warnings from beyond the grave. He had always dismissed these tales as mere superstition, the product of overactive imaginations. But as he prepared for another routine flight, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was different this time. The plane, a Lockheed L-1011, had recently undergone maintenance, and Jack was tasked with inspecting the systems before takeoff. As he walked through the empty cabin, the faint smell of smoke lingered in the air, a smell that shouldn't have been there. Jack frowned and made a mental note to report it later. In the galley, he noticed something strange. The oven door, which had been securely closed, was now slightly ajar. Jack approached it cautiously, his pulse quickening. As he peered into the small window, his breath caught in his throat. Staring back at him was the pale, ghostly face of a man. The man's eyes were hollow, his expression a mix of sadness and urgency. Jack stumbled back, blinking rapidly. The face was gone. He rubbed his eyes, convinced that it had been a trick of the light, a figment of his imagination. But the image of that haunting face was burned into his mind, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Determined to maintain his composure, Jack continued his inspection, but the unease gnawed at him. He checked the instruments, the flight controls, the engines, everything seemed in order. But that lingering sense of dread remained, like a shadow that followed him wherever he went. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Jack tried to push the encounter out of his mind. He was a professional, after all, and there was no room for fear or superstition in his line of work. But as the engines roared to life and the plane ascended into the night sky, Jack couldn't help but feel that they were not alone on this flight, that the past was still with them, whispering its warnings from the shadows. Chapter 2, Echoes of the Fallen. Jack's encounter with the ghostly figure in the galley was just the beginning. As the flight progressed, the strange occurrences began to multiply. It started with small things. A cold draft that seemed to come from nowhere, the flickering of the cabin lights, the sensation of being watched. But soon, the incidents became more alarming. During the meal service, one of the flight attendants, Sarah, noticed that the coffee pot had been mysteriously refilled after she had just emptied it. When she turned to ask her colleague if they had refilled it, she saw him staring at something behind her, his face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Did you see that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "See what?" Sarah asked, her heart pounding in her chest. There was a man, standing right behind you, he stammered. I saw him just for a second, but he was there. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She quickly turned around, but the galley was empty. The only sound was the low hum of the engines and the distant murmur of the passengers. She tried to laugh it off, but the fear in her colleague's eyes was unmistakable. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Robert Bob Larson was going over the flight plan with his co-pilot, Mike. They had flown this route countless times before, and everything seemed normal. But then, without warning, the autopilot disengaged, and the plane lurched to the side. What the hell? Bob exclaimed, grabbing the controls and steadying the aircraft. Did you do that? No, Mike replied, shaking his head in confusion. I didn't touch anything. Bob quickly re-engaged the autopilot, but his hands were shaking. He had heard the stories too, the ghostly warnings, the unexplained malfunctions, but he had never believed them. Now, he wasn't so sure. As the flight continued, more strange incidents occurred. A passenger reported seeing a man standing in the aisle, staring blankly ahead, only for him to vanish when she blinked. Another passenger claimed to hear someone whispering her name, but when she looked around, no one was there. Jack tried to keep his mind focused on his duties, but the tension in the cabin was palpable. The crew exchanged nervous glances, and even the passengers seemed uneasy, as if they could sense that something was not right. Jack knew that he needed to stay calm, to be the voice of reason, but deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched by something or someone that did not belong in this world. As the plane approached its destination, Jack's thoughts returned to the face he had seen in the galley window. He had dismissed it as a hallucination, a trick of the light, but now he wasn't so sure. Could it be that the stories were true? That the ghosts of Flight 318 were still with them, trapped in the salvaged parts of the plane, forever bound to the aircraft that had become their tomb? Jack didn't have time to dwell on these thoughts. As the plane began its descent, the lights flickered once more, and the temperature in the cabin seemed to drop. Jack's heart raced as he heard a faint whisper in his ear, a voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Watch out for fire. Jack froze, his blood running cold. He knew that voice. It was the same voice he had heard in his nightmares, the voice of the man whose face he had seen in the galley window. But before he could react, the plane shuddered violently, and a deafening roar filled the cabin. The plane was on fire. Chapter 3: The Fire Within. Panic erupted in the cabin as the flames spread rapidly. Jack's training kicked in, and he rushed to the cockpit, where Captain Bob and Mike were struggling to maintain control of the aircraft. The fire had started in one of the engines, and it was quickly spreading to the wing. We are losing altitude, Bob shouted over the roar of the flames. We need to land now, Mike yelled, his voice filled with urgency. Jack grabbed the fire extinguisher and rushed to the galley, where the flames were the fiercest. As he sprayed the extinguisher, he caught a glimpse of the ghostly figure once more, standing just beyond the flames, watching him with hollow eyes. Help us! Jack shouted, but the figure remained silent, its expression unreadable. The fire continued to rage, and Jack knew that they were running out of time. The plane was descending rapidly, and the flames showed no signs of abating. In the chaos, he heard the voice again, clearer this time, as if the ghost was standing right beside him. Use the checklist, check the circuit breakers. Jack's heart pounded as he realized that the ghost was trying to help. He rushed back to the cockpit, where Bob and Mike were desperately trying to regain control. The checklist, Jack shouted. We need to check the circuit breakers. Bob and Mike exchanged a quick glance, then nodded. Together, they went through the emergency procedures, checking the circuit breakers and attempting to isolate the source of the fire. The flames began to subside, but the plane was still losing altitude fast. We are going to have to make an emergency landing, Bob said, his voice grim. There's a clearing up ahead, Mike replied. We can try to put her down there. The plane shuddered again as it descended, the engines struggling to stay aloft. Jack's mind raced as he thought of the ghostly figure. Was it the spirit of a fallen crew member, trapped in the remnants of Flight 318? Was this apparition trying to help them, or was it simply a harbinger of the doom that awaited them? Captain Bob Larson gripped the controls tightly, his knuckles white with the effort. The clearing was rapidly approaching, but the plane was losing altitude too quickly. Sweat dripped down his forehead as he wrestled with the yoke, trying to keep the plane steady. "Brace for impact," Bob shouted over the intercom, his voice barely masking the fear that gripped him. The passengers, already in a state of panic, followed the command with terrified obedience. The cabin was filled with the sounds of crying, prayers, and the frantic rustling of seatbelts being tightened. Sarah, the flight attendant who had earlier witnessed the unexplained events, moved quickly through the aisle, trying to calm the passengers as best as she could. Jack could feel the heat from the remaining flames licking at his back as he returned to the cockpit. The temperature was rising, and the acrid smell of burning metal and plastic filled his nostrils. The image of the ghostly face he had seen earlier flashed in his mind again, and he couldn't shake the feeling that they were being guided, perhaps even protected, by something beyond the veil of death. Suddenly, the plane lurched violently to the side, throwing Jack against the cockpit door. The emergency alarms blared, and the cockpit lights flickered ominously. "We are losing the left engine," Mike shouted, his voice strained with panic. "We are going down too fast." Bob gritted his teeth and fought to level the plane, but it was clear that they were in a dire situation. The clearing was coming up fast, but the plane was descending too steeply. They were going to crash. "Hold on," Bob yelled, his voice a mix of determination and desperation. The plane hit the ground with a bone-jarring impact. The sound of metal tearing and the screams of the passengers filled the air as the aircraft skidded across the clearing, its momentum dragging it through the trees at the edge of the field. The world outside the cockpit windows became a blur of green and brown as the plane plowed through the underbrush, leaving a trail of destruction in its wake. Jack was thrown forward, his head slamming against the control panel. Pain exploded behind his eyes, and for a moment, everything went black. When he came to, the plane had come to a stop, tilted at an odd angle, with the nose buried in the earth. Smoke filled the cabin, and the red glow of fire illuminated the wreckage. Jack groaned as he unbuckled his harness and staggered to his feet. His vision swam, and his ears rang with the aftermath of the crash. "Bob? Mike, you guys okay?" Jack rasped, his voice hoarse from the smoke. There was no response. Jack turned to see both men slumped in their seats, unconscious but alive. He quickly checked their pulses, weak but steady. Relief washed over him, but it was short-lived as he realized the full extent of their situation. The passengers were trapped in the burning wreckage, and the fire was spreading. Jack knew they didn't have much time before the flames consumed the entire aircraft. He had to act quickly if he was going to save anyone. As he stumbled out of the cockpit, Jack caught sight of the ghostly figure once more, standing in the aisle, its expression more urgent than before. The figure pointed toward the emergency exit, and Jack understood the silent message. He rushed to the exit, throwing open the door and deploying the emergency slide. The cool night air rushed in, a stark contrast to the inferno raging inside the plane. Jack began directing the passengers toward the exit, helping them escape one by one. Sarah, bruised but determined, joined Jack in the rescue effort. Together, they worked to free as many passengers as possible, their movements fueled by adrenaline and fear. The fire roared behind them, inching closer with every passing second. "Go! Go!" Jack urged, his voice raw as he shoved another passenger toward the exit. But even as he focused on the living, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that the dead were with them, guiding their every move. The ghostly figure had disappeared, but its presence lingered, like a protective force that refused to abandon them. Finally, the last of the passengers had been evacuated, and Jack was about to follow them when he heard a faint cry from the back of the plane. He hesitated, torn between the safety of the outside world and the desperate plea for help. "I'm coming," Jack shouted as he turned back into the smoke-filled cabin. He raced toward the sound, his vision blurred by the thick smoke. The heat was unbearable, and every breath burned his lungs, but Jack pressed on, determined to save whoever was trapped. In the rear of the plane, he found a young boy, no more than 8 years old, pinned under a fallen seat. The boy's eyes were wide with terror, his small hands reaching out for help. "Hold on, kid," Jack said, his voice cracking as he struggled to free the boy from the wreckage. The flames were closing in, and Jack knew he had only moments to spare. With a final burst of strength, he lifted the seat and pulled the boy into his arms. The child clung to him, his tears mixing with the soot on his face. Jack turned and ran, his legs screaming in protest as he sprinted toward the emergency exit. The fire was right behind them, a wall of heat and flame that threatened to consume them both. Just as Jack reached the exit, the plane shuddered violently, and the roof began to collapse. In that instant, Jack felt a cold hand on his shoulder, a touch that sent a shiver down his spine despite the searing heat. He glanced back and saw the ghostly figure once more, standing amidst the flames, its eyes filled with an inexplicable sorrow. "Go," the figure whispered, its voice barely audible over the roar of the fire. "Save him." Jack didn't need to be told twice. He leaped onto the emergency slide, cradling the boy in his arms as they slid to safety. The moment they hit the ground, the plane behind them erupted into a fireball, the explosion lighting up the night sky like a second sun. Jack shielded the boy with his body, the force of the blast knocking them both to the ground. When the noise finally subsided, Jack looked up to see the burning wreckage of the plane, now little more than a twisted, flaming heap. The boy was sobbing, clinging to Jack with all the strength his small body could muster. Jack held him close, his heart pounding with a mix of relief and sorrow. They had made it out alive, but the memory of the ghostly figure, the spirit that had saved them, would haunt him forever. As the flames continued to consume the remains of the plane, Jack knew that they had been touched by something otherworldly, something that defied explanation. And in the depths of his soul, he understood that the ghosts of Flight 318 were not at rest. They had reached out from beyond the grave, offering a warning and a chance at salvation, but their story was far from over. Chapter 4: Haunting Echoes. In the days following the crash, Jack found himself plagued by nightmares. Every time he closed his eyes, he was back in the burning plane, the ghostly figure watching him from the shadows. The boy's terrified cries echoed in his mind, and the scent of smoke seemed to linger in his nostrils no matter where he went. He tried to shake it off, to convince himself that it had all been a stress-induced hallucination, a byproduct of the trauma he had endured. But the memories were too vivid, too real, to dismiss so easily. Sarah, who had survived the crash alongside him, had her own tales to tell. She spoke of the strange occurrences she had witnessed in the days leading up to the disaster, the unexplained phenomena, the ghostly apparitions. She, too, was haunted by the events of that night, unable to rid herself of the feeling that they had been touched by something beyond the realm of the living. The airline conducted an investigation, as they always did after a crash. They analyzed the wreckage, reviewed the flight data, and interviewed the survivors. But there was no mention of the supernatural in their reports, no acknowledgement of the strange events that had occurred before and during the flight. Jack knew that no one would believe them if they spoke of what they had seen. The world wasn't ready to accept the possibility that the dead could reach out to the living, that spirits could haunt the very planes that had once carried them. And so, Jack and Sarah kept their experiences to themselves, sharing their stories only with each other in hushed tones. But even as they tried to move on, the hauntings continued. Jack began to notice strange things happening in his home, the sound of footsteps when no one was there, objects moving on their own, and the unmistakable feeling of being watched. He would wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, with the sensation of cold hands brushing against his skin. It wasn't just him. Other survivors reported similar experiences. The nightmares, the unexplained phenomena, the feeling that they were being followed by something unseen. It was as if the spirits of Flight 318 had latched onto them, unwilling to let go. One of the survivors, a middle-aged woman named Lisa, spoke of seeing a shadowy figure in her home, tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to burn with an inner fire. She would wake up in the middle of the night to find the figure standing at the foot of her bed, its gaze fixed on her with a terrifying intensity. Another survivor, a man named Greg, claimed that his television would turn on by itself, always to the same news report, a broadcast from the day after the crash. The image would flicker and distort, but the voice of the anchor would remain clear, repeating the details of the disaster over and over again. Even those who had been skeptical of the supernatural began to question their beliefs as the strange events continued. It was as if the spirits of Flight 318 were trying to send a message, to reach out to the living in a desperate attempt to be heard. Jack knew that he couldn't ignore the signs any longer. He had to find out what had happened to Flight 318, why the spirits of the dead were haunting them, and what they wanted. But where to start? The official investigation had yielded nothing unusual, no signs of foul play, no mechanical failures that could explain the crash. The airline had declared it an accident, a tragic but unremarkable disaster. Jack's thoughts kept returning to the ghostly figure he had seen, the spirit that had guided him to safety. There was something about that apparition that felt different from the others, more purposeful, more intentional. It was as if the figure had a mission, something it needed to accomplish. Driven by a need for answers, Jack decided to do some investigating of his own. He began by reaching out to the families of the victims, hoping to find some connection, some clue that would explain the hauntings. Many were reluctant to speak, still reeling from the loss of their loved ones, but a few were willing to share their stories. One family spoke of their son, a young man who had been a passenger on Flight 318. He had been a pilot in training, with dreams of one day captaining his own plane. His mother showed Jack a picture of her son in his uniform, his face full of hope and determination. Another family told of their daughter, a flight attendant who had been working her final shift before taking a leave of absence to get married. Her fiancé had been waiting at the airport for her arrival, only to be met with the devastating news of the crash. As Jack listened to their stories, he began to see a pattern. Many of the victims had been connected to the airline industry in some way: pilots, flight attendants, ground crew. They had all shared a passion for flying, a love for the skies. It was as if they had been drawn together by a common purpose, a shared destiny that had been cut tragically short. But there was more to it than that. Jack started to dig deeper into the history of the airline, uncovering a series of incidents that had been quietly swept under the rug: accidents, malfunctions, and mysterious deaths that had plagued the company for years. It was as if the airline was cursed, doomed to suffer one tragedy after another. The more he uncovered, the more Jack became convinced that the hauntings were connected to something far deeper than a single crash. There was a darkness at the heart of the airline, a malevolent force that had been growing stronger with each passing year. And now, it had reached out from the shadows to claim the lives of those aboard Flight 318. But why? What was the source of this darkness? And why had it chosen to reveal itself now? Jack knew that he had to find out. The lives of the survivors, and the souls of the dead, depended on it. Jack's investigation into the haunting of Flight 318 deepened, revealing unsettling truths. He discovered that the airline had a history of covering up mysterious incidents, fatal accidents, unexplained equipment failures, and strange occurrences that plagued its flights. These events seemed to be linked to a dark force, an entity that had grown stronger over the years, feeding on the tragedies that befell the airline. One particular case caught Jack's attention. Years ago, there had been a crash similar to Flight 318's. The official reports had blamed it on pilot error, but survivors whispered of ghostly apparitions and eerie premonitions before the disaster. The crash site had been in the same remote area, a place known to locals as the Vale, a region with a long history of supernatural activity. Jack felt a chill as he realized the connection. The Vale was no ordinary place, it was a convergence point, a thin spot between the living world and the afterlife. The airline had been flying through this area for years, and the spirits of the dead were trying to communicate, warning the living of the dangers that lurked there. But the darkness Jack had uncovered was not just confined to the skies. It had seeped into the very fabric of the airline itself, corrupting everything it touched. Employees spoke in hushed tones of strange occurrences in the hangars, of shadows moving on their own, of voices whispering in the night. Jack knew that the haunting of Flight 318 was not just about the crash. It was about something much larger, something that had been festering for decades. The spirits of the dead were not at peace, and they would not rest until the truth was revealed. As Jack pieced together the clues, he began to see a pattern. The spirits were drawn to the survivors, to those who had escaped death, as if they were trying to send a message. They appeared in dreams, in reflections, in fleeting glimpses out of the corner of the eye, always watching, always waiting. One night, as Jack pored over old flight logs and maintenance records, he felt a presence behind him. He turned slowly, expecting to see nothing, but there, standing in the doorway, was the ghostly figure of the pilot who had saved him during the crash. The pilot's eyes were filled with a sorrow that seemed to stretch beyond time, and when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. "You must stop it," the pilot said. "You must put an end to the cycle, or more will die." Before Jack could respond, the figure vanished, leaving behind only a lingering sense of dread. The message was clear: Whatever force was behind the hauntings, it was not finished. It would continue to claim lives unless Jack could find a way to stop it. But how? The airline was a massive, faceless corporation, more concerned with profits and public image than with the lives of its employees or passengers. And the darkness that surrounded it was elusive, hidden in the shadows, defying explanation or confrontation. Jack knew he was running out of time. The incidents were escalating, the hauntings becoming more frequent and more intense. He could feel the darkness closing in, suffocating him, and he knew that if he didn't act soon, it would consume him just as it had consumed so many others. Driven by desperation, Jack decided to go public with what he had found. He reached out to the media, to the families of the victims, to anyone who would listen. He knew it was a long shot, but he had to try. The truth had to come out, no matter the cost. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The story of the haunted airline spread like wildfire, capturing the public's imagination and sparking a wave of fear and outrage. People demanded answers, demanded that the airline be held accountable for the deaths and the cover-ups. But as the pressure mounted, so did the danger. Jack began receiving threats, anonymous messages warning him to stop his investigation, to back off before it was too late. He knew he was getting close to something the airline, and whatever force controlled it, didn't want him to find. Undeterred, Jack pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. He knew that the spirits of Flight 318 were counting on him, that their restless souls needed closure. And deep down, he knew that his own survival depended on it. As the story continued to unfold, Jack found himself in a race against time, battling both the living and the dead in a desperate bid to break the cycle of death and destruction that had plagued the airline for so long. And all the while, the darkness loomed ever closer, waiting for its chance to strike. Chapter 5: The Darkness Beneath. Jack's revelation of the airline's haunting secret ignited a media firestorm, but the more he uncovered, the more dangerous his pursuit became. He started receiving anonymous threats, warning him to stop his investigation. Despite the mounting danger, Jack pressed on, driven by the need to uncover the truth and free the restless souls of Flight 318. As Jack delved deeper, he uncovered a disturbing pattern. The airline had been plagued by strange incidents for decades. Each time, the official reports attributed the events to technical failures or human error, but survivors and witnesses told a different story, of ghostly apparitions, eerie premonitions, and unexplained phenomena. One of the most chilling cases was that of a flight attendant who had survived a near-fatal accident, only to be haunted by the ghost of a colleague who had died in the crash. The apparition appeared to her repeatedly, always warning of impending danger. Despite her pleas for help, the airline dismissed her concerns, attributing her experiences to trauma. Eventually, the flight attendant took her own life, unable to escape the relentless haunting. Jack knew that these stories were not just isolated incidents. They were part of a larger pattern, a curse that had been passed down through the airline's history. The spirits of the dead were trapped, unable to move on, and they were reaching out to the living in a desperate attempt to be heard. But the deeper Jack dug, the more resistance he encountered. The airline's executives were determined to keep the truth buried, and they would stop at nothing to protect their interests. Jack found himself followed, his phone tapped, his every move monitored. The darkness was closing in, and he knew that time was running out. In a last-ditch effort to uncover the truth, Jack decided to return to the crash site of Flight 318. He knew that the answers he sought lay there, in the remote wilderness where the plane had gone down. But the journey would not be easy. The Vale was a place of power, a place where the boundaries between worlds were thin. Those who entered often did not return. Undeterred, Jack set out on his journey, guided by the ghostly pilot who had saved him during the crash. As he ventured deeper into the Vale, he encountered the spirits of the dead, their faces twisted with pain and anger. They whispered warnings, pleaded for help, and pointed the way forward. Finally, after days of treacherous travel, Jack reached the crash site. The wreckage of Flight 318 lay scattered across the landscape, a twisted monument to the tragedy that had occurred there. But as Jack approached, he felt a presence, dark, malevolent, and powerful. The entity that had haunted the airline for so long was here, waiting for him. Jack knew that he was not alone. The spirits of the dead were with him, their collective will giving him the strength to confront the darkness. As he stood before the wreckage, the ghostly pilot appeared once more, his eyes burning with a fierce determination. "You must end this," the pilot said, his voice echoing in the stillness. "The curse has taken too many lives. You are the only one who can break it." With the spirits of the dead guiding him, Jack delved into the wreckage, searching for the source of the curse. It was there, buried beneath the twisted metal and broken glass, a relic of the past, an object of great power that had been cursed long ago. The darkness had latched onto it, feeding on the pain and suffering of those who had perished in the crashes. But as Jack reached out to destroy the relic, the darkness lashed out, enveloping him in a suffocating cloud of fear and despair. He could feel the weight of the curse pressing down on him, threatening to crush his very soul. In that moment, Jack realized that the darkness was not just a malevolent force. It was a manifestation of the pain and suffering of the spirits who had been trapped for so long. They were the curse, their anger and sorrow binding them to the relic and to the airline. With a newfound resolve, Jack reached out to the spirits, offering them peace and release. He promised to tell their stories, to make sure that the truth was known and that their deaths would not be in vain. The darkness hesitated, then slowly began to dissipate as the spirits accepted Jack's offer. One by one, they began to fade, their faces softening as they found the peace they had long sought. The ghostly pilot was the last to go, his eyes filled with gratitude as he nodded to Jack before disappearing into the night. As the last of the spirits faded away, the relic crumbled to dust in Jack's hands. The curse was broken, and the darkness was gone. Exhausted but victorious, Jack made his way back to civilization, determined to honor his promise. He published his findings, exposing the airline's dark history and the truth behind the hauntings. The story captivated the world, and the airline was forced to take responsibility for its actions. In the end, Jack had not only uncovered the truth, he had given the spirits of Flight 318 the closure they deserved. The hauntings ceased, and the airline eventually went out of business, unable to recover from the scandal. But Jack knew that the darkness he had faced was not unique to the airline. It was a reminder of the consequences of unchecked greed and corruption. He continued his work, determined to shine a light on the dark corners of the world and to help those who had been wronged. The story of Flight 318 became a legend, a cautionary tale of the dangers that lurk in the shadows. And though the spirits were gone, their memory lived on, a testament to the power of truth and the resilience of the human spirit. Epilogue: The Final Flight. Years later, Jack stood at the edge of the veil, looking out over the crash site of Flight 318. The wreckage had been cleared away, but the memory of the tragedy remained. He could still feel the presence of the spirits, not as a haunting, but as a gentle whisper on the wind, a reminder of the journey he had undertaken and the lives he had touched. As he turned to leave, a voice called out to him, soft and familiar. "Thank you," it said, and Jack knew that the spirits had finally found peace. With a sense of closure, Jack walked away from the veil, leaving the darkness behind. But he knew that his work was not over. There were still stories to uncover, still truths to reveal, and he would continue to fight for those who could not fight for themselves, guided by the memory of the spirits who had trusted him to tell their story. The skies were clear as Jack left the veil, the sun shining brightly overhead. It was a new day, a new beginning, and Jack was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. For the darkness was not gone, it was only waiting for its next opportunity, and Jack would be there, ready to confront it once more. The end.
Thanks for tuning in to our podcast. If you enjoyed our exploration of ghosts, mythical creatures, and urban legends, please share it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe for more thrilling episodes. Until next time, my beloved listeners.